Hello, this is the Death Row and Executions channel. My name is Paco Rivera. You can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more Death Row news. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. Also, check out my other channel here on YouTube called The Maximum Sentence, where I cover recent crimes and convictions. There will also be a link for that. After Norman Grimm Jr. was found guilty at trial for the 1998 murder of 41-year-old Cynthia Campbell, the case went to the penalty or sentencing phase, and by that time it was shown in the transcripts that Norman Grimm wants to die. According to the report, that makes this an unusual capital case. He was convicted of committing a first-degree murder and indecent assault, but he refused to let his attorney present any mitigating evidence or argument at the penalty phase hearing. This is not the first time that I've seen this. Several times I've seen where someone tried for capital murder, didn't get his way, wasn't found innocent, or wasn't found mentally insane, which I think his lawyers had also considered. So his mindset is, if I'm going to spend a long time in prison or the rest of my life in prison, then I'd rather be dead. It's more common than you might think. The victim in this case, Cynthia Campbell, was herself a lawyer. And as a lawyer, she had enemies. But it wasn't one of her enemies that killed her. However, at about 5 o'clock in the morning, on July 27 of the year 1998, a Monday morning, it does appear that she was victimized by one of those enemies while inside her home in East Milton, Florida, a region just north of Pensacola Beach in the Florida Panhandle. Cynthia was victimized by a drive-by lug nut throwing enemy. Yeah, a lug nut came crashing through one of her windows. So Cynthia called police to report the incident. Cynthia had a neighbor next door who it appears was awakened by his 3 dogs barking at the presence of police officers outside attending to the situation next door. That neighbor living next to Cynthia was Norman Grimm Jr. Grimm walked over to his neighbor's house and Cynthia explained to him what had happened. While a police officer was taking notes for his report, that officer heard Norman Grimm invite Cynthia over to his house for a cup of coffee. This was soon after 5 o'clock in the morning, so yeah, coffee is always a good idea at that time. But the officer heard Cynthia decline the offer. She and the officer continued their investigation into what happened with a lug nut flying through her window inside her house, and while inside the house, they heard a very loud snapping sound. The officer would later say that it almost sounded like a gun being fired. So the officer and Cynthia went back outside and discovered a tree branch on her car. A branch had snapped off the tree and fell on her car, damaging her car. It would be an understatement to say that Cynthia's day had gotten off to a very bad start. As it turns out, Cynthia's neighbor, Norman Grimm, also heard the sound and saw some unusual activity with Cynthia and the police officer circling her car with a big tree log sitting on it, and he walked over again to find out what was going on. Very nosy neighbor, isn't he? Anyway, the officer finished up his report and he heard Norman Grimm once again invite Cynthia over to his place for a cup of coffee. This time Cynthia said sure, and as far as anyone was concerned, that is exactly what she did after the police officer left the area. The next time Cynthia Campbell was seen, her dead body was floating on the waters of Pensacola Bay. Cynthia Campbell had an appointment to meet with her bookkeeper regarding her law practice at 7:30 in the morning. So by the time the police officer had completed his report and left, and she completed having a cup of coffee at the home of her neighbor, Norman Grimm, she must have been down to just minutes remaining to make it to that 7:30 meeting. But she didn't show up. And she was supposed to meet with her secretary and paralegal about a half hour later at 8 o'clock in the morning to discuss some issues. She failed to show up at that meeting as well. The bookkeeper, knowing how reliable and prompt Cynthia was, became worried, and she went over to the house to see if Cynthia was there. She found the front door open. The lights in her house were still on, and her car was still parked outside the house. Probably still damaged from the tree, but it was still there. The bookkeeper called out for Cynthia throughout the house. Nothing. And then the secretary that Cynthia was supposed to meet with at 8 o'clock was also worried and also arrived at the house to help look for Cynthia, but they couldn't find her. Of course, this all appears extremely strange to them, so police were called. And then the nosy neighbor, Norman Grimm, also arrived at the house to see what was going on. Police arrived on the property, and the best they could do was complete a missing persons report. But with the lights still on, the door open, the car still there, Cynthia could not have gone far. Police glanced over at the property of Norman Grimm, who was still standing there at Cynthia's property wondering what was going on, and they asked Grimm, "Hey, do you mind if we have a look inside and around your property?" Well, Grimm hesitated. He had an expression that he was not happy about police searching around his house, and police noticed that, making Grimm appear suspicious. But Grimm had a change of heart and said, "Sure," and allowed police to look inside his home. Can you imagine what they would have thought had he flat out said, "Nah, you need a search warrant," or saying stupid like that? So he smartened up and allowed them onto his property. The officers observed some black drops on the floor, but nothing suspicious. No blood anywhere or signs of a struggle. They did see some reddish-brown stains on the shorts that Grimm was wearing. Then they looked inside his car, but again found nothing suspicious. But when they asked to look inside the trunk of the car, Grimm told them that he did not have the key to the trunk. How do you not have a key to the trunk of your car? Now, at that point, something crazy happened. Norman Grimm's 3 dogs had gotten loose and escaped down the road. Grimm told the officers that he needed to go after his dogs. The police had followed him for a while, but eventually lost him and didn't bother to continue looking for him. They later went back to his house to wait for him to return, but he never came back. Police probably should have continued following him, because sometime later, a witness said that she saw Norman Grimm's car parked near a Pensacola Bay fishing bridge and that the trunk of his car was wide open. He miraculously found the key. About 2 hours later, a fisherman fishing off the fishing bridge at Pensacola Bay snagged something with his fishing pole hook and pulled it in, and realized that the hook was attached to the dead body of a human being, a woman, later positively identified as 42-year-old Cynthia Campbell. She was wrapped in sheets from a bed and tied with a rope. Garbage bags and masking tape was also used. As it turns out, the investigation had always led back to Norman Grimm, and a search warrant was issued to search his property. And inside the home, they found the exact same kind of beddings matching the sheet wrapped around the victim. The same exact type of rope used to tie Cynthia was found in his home. Also, the same type of masking tape and garbage bags used to dispose of the body were found in his home. Cynthia's eyeglasses, something she was always wearing and must wear, was inside Norman Grimm's house. And then we have the icing on the cake. DNA evidence of Cynthia's blood in the kitchen and dining room. Weapons used in the killing were also recovered. The medical examiner determined that Cynthia had been hit with a blunt instrument, possibly a recovered claw hammer, 18 times in the head. She had been stabbed at least 11 times, with 7 of those wounds to the heart. She had defensive wounds on her left hand, and her privates had been slashed. There were obvious signs that Cynthia was also violated. Norman Grimm had gone on the run while these investigations were taking place. He had to know the jig was up when detectives were closing in on him. This was 1998. This was not the 1980s or 1970s. By this time, with forensics so advanced, getting away with a crime like this is nearly impossible. In today's day and age, I would say it is even more impossible. You have surveillance cameras everywhere, facial recognition, license plate readers, cell phone tracking data. Yet, it continues to happen. You know, I sometimes think that some of these criminals are not that stupid. They know full well they will eventually be caught, but they want to live out a fantasy anyway, and the hell with whatever happens to them. Anyway, 3 days after committing the crime, Grimm was captured in Watauga, Oklahoma, where his father lived. Lawyers for Norman Grimm tried to convince the court that Cynthia Campbell had a lot of enemies. Cynthia was a lawyer. Of course she had a lot of enemies. And she had received many threatening messages. And Grimm's lawyers said that it had to be one of those enemies that killed Cynthia. The jury didn't buy it. About a decade before the murder of Cynthia Campbell, from 1983 to 1990, Grimm had served time in prison after being convicted of robbery, armed burglary, kidnapping, and aggravated battery. He later moved to Texas and robbed a store. He was arrested again, served some time in Texas, and then was released on parole. He had his parole transferred to Florida, and he was still on parole in 1998 when he killed Cynthia Campbell. Some people just can't be rehabilitated. Why bother with parole? Please go ahead and hit the subscribe button for more death row and upcoming execution stories so that you're alerted when the next one comes out. You can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. My name is Paco Rivera. Take care. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.